Welcome, and thank you for attending this event in remembering with me my brother Kasra Vafadari. Kasra was against mourning. He believed in birthdays and in life. And we are here to celebrate Kasra's life together. Kasra was born in Iran in March of 1946 to a Zoroastrian family of
مهرانگیز فیروزگر and Ardeshir Vafadari, eldest of 4 brothers, Kaveh, Goshtasp, Karan, and me, Kate. 50 years ago, Iran was going through a lot of changes, and us, the children of Vafadari and Firuzgar, were all brought up differently because we grew up in different eras and environment and lived different lives. Passage of time had touched the 5 of us, sister and brothers, in different ways and made different people from us. And yet, we were very close in spirit. We all grew up to be very proud of our origin. We all share the philosophy of Zoroaster, that good and bad have always existed and will always exist. And we have to stand up to the evil with good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. پندار نیک، گفتار نیک، کردار نیک. Our belief that the struggles of good and evil is ever present guided us not to be silent, but fight for the good and to try to make a difference. Kasra was 10 years old and Kaveh only 8 when they were sent to England to go to school and receive education. I was told that Kasra and Kaveh were sent to a boarding school in England to study and to become better people. They had to suffer for a higher cause, to eventually serve their country. During their childhood, my 2 brothers had a hard life growing up. They had to suffer the pain of separation from their family and experience the British boarding school system of violence as a disciplinary routine. In reality, many of those who were sent abroad to study never returned to homeland. But both of my brothers, Kasra and Kaveh, proved to be an exception and did return to their homeland. In 1964, after graduating from high school with good results, Kasra was admitted to MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a scholarship to study physics. In those days, not many foreigners, especially from Middle East, were admitted to MIT. In 1968, as American involvement in the Vietnam War peaked, more and more Americans took part in peace initiatives across the United States to protest against the continuing war. Kasra was outspoken. He was outspoken even as a in that young age, and spoke out against the US involvement in Vietnam. He firmly stood by his anti-war beliefs. At this time, according to the United States law, men were being drafted. They were enrolled compulsorily to armed forces. When Kasra was drafted to join the US Army to fight in the Vietnam War, he refused to participate in that war on the grounds of being a Zoroastrian. He did not go to war as a conscientious objector. He campaigned for peace and not war. In 1970, Kasra left the United States for Ireland, where he continued study for his master's degree in education at Trinity College of Dublin. In fact, he did not ever return to the United States. He married and settled in France, but within a few years, he decided to go to Iran, where he started teaching as an Ostad-Yar, or assistant professor, in what is now Beheshti University of Tehran. Kasra was living with his wife and 2 children in a barn that he had turned into a small house on a farm that my father, Ardeshir, had started outside Tehran in Saidabad. And that was when the 1979 Iranian Revolution took place. He was on the side of the revolution, like most of the populists, and enthusiastically took part in it. He joined his local neighborhood committee, Shoray Mahalli Saidabad. But then later, committees turned radically Islamic, leaving no room for a person like him. With the onset of the Iraq War, Kasra moved back to France to continue his education, where he earned his doctorate from Sorbonne University of Paris in ancient Iranian history, and started teaching history at Nanterre University of Paris. In early 90s, as he traveled with his family back and forth to Iran, he became more and more interested in the Zoroastrian cause and started doing research on history, religion, customs, and ceremonies of his country's traditions and the way they were living. He traveled around Iran and met all kinds of people. He had one year to retire and settle in Iran for good. Meanwhile, he would go to Iran on every occasion he could find. He wanted a happy and healthy Iran. And to reach his dream, he started at the roots. He invited young Iranian Zoroastrians who did not have much hope in the future to engage in history research groups. He organized research classes on Zoroastrianism by Zoroastrians and non-Zoroastrians alike. He brought together young people to practice music, instruments, and singing, to exercise and to practice plays in our parents' house. He believed in helping people by opening the road for them to education and wisdom. He started working with Iranian universities for this purpose, notably in Kerman. During this time, he produced a number of short books documenting the culture and traditions of Zoroastrians. Once the confines of our home turned small, he embarked on a much bigger task of creating cultural centers in Yazd and Kerman for this purpose. His work in Yazd was continued after his death, and the 2 centers he had established in Yazd were named Khane Kasra and Khane Senik. His work gave confidence to the Zoroastrian community, gave hope to young Iranians, and showed them the beautiful, important parts of their cultural heritage. He believed that the Iranian Zoroastrian community must not despair into the Western world. Kasra tried to teach our youth once again to love their country, be proud of their past history, and encourage them to stay in Iran, not to become refugees in foreign countries. He wanted to give the young Zoroastrians the energy to keep on, the hope to go on. Kasra was trying to bring light to undermined and forgotten Iranian culture. He started the internet site Yata'ahu as a forum for the young Zoroastrians. For his last birthday, he organized a celebration in the ruins of Takht Jamshid, or Persepolis, and invited foreign media to go along. Just to introduce them to the Iranian heritage and our past. He organized tours for Iranian Zoroastrians and those interested in Atash Khane Gashtaseb in Azerbaijan and also Tajikistan. The case of Zoroastrian revival in the recent historic landscape is of particular importance. A small minority of only 10,000 represents a very large footprint of traditions in Iran and adjacent regions. As a measure of this footprint, we can name celebrations such as Eid Nowruz, Chharshanbe Suri, Mehregan, Tirgan, Yalda, Sadeh, and other jashns or celebrations by the Zoroastrian tradition and calendar that probably go as far back as there is history of this region, all of which are days of celebration that are recognized by almost everyone as Orf and Adat. Accepted customs and traditions, no longer representing any particular religion. These customs and traditions reach beyond Iran, into Kurdistan, Azerbaijan, Republic of Caspian, territories as far as Tajikistan or Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even parts of Iraq and beyond. Kasra became so absorbed by his work and his research as he had embarked on a rediscovery track of history and culture of Zoroastrian that we can expect it to continue for many years to come. As a pioneer in this area of work and research in post-Islamic era of Iran, Kasra found himself pulled in this direction ever more forcefully in action that, given the nature of political schism in Iran, was never without its peril. It is unfortunate that the plight of minorities in Iran and Middle East is not seen by the authorities as a great opportunity for natural revival and development of the greater society in general. Kasra's research and work on Zoroastrian tradition showed once again that one individual can make a difference. Kasra's free spirit touched everyone's life he came in contact with, his own way that he knew. He was outspoken and in this road had become popular and many times warned by his outspokenness. Certainly, if Kasra had lived, he would have reached many more of his goals. And as far as many of us are concerned, had he been allowed a longer life, he would have benefited more from his achievements and accomplishments. But in 2005, his life was cut short. He was murdered during sleeping hours in Paris, the night before he was to fly back to Tehran. A blow to our society, all Iranians, and especially Zoroastrians. In celebrating Kasra's life and time, we praise a man who went beyond the call of duty, who gave hope and compassion without being a mobed or a priest, a person who brought in warmth wherever he went. We shall never forget his smiles, his jokes, his light but real attitude, and his non-conformist approach. This was even reflected in the fact that he never went anywhere without his bow tie, even in Iran. Kasra was a hope not only for young Zoroastrians, but for all Iranians. Kasra greatly believed in artistic and intellectual and religious freedom for all. He respected all religions and did not see any difference between Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, or a Zoroastrian. He loved all people, no matter where they came from. He believed in this world, not any other. Love of humanity and reaching across one's religion and personal beliefs to achieve unity and freedom. He is probably the only Zoroastrian of modern times that took this message in one occasion to a mosque audience in Iran. It is with this spirit that we celebrate Kasra's legacy and his insistence on the need of such an event. As his younger sister, who was always very close to him, I can only cherish his life. Remember his good deeds, recall his true words, and hope that everyone will continue his efforts and remember his legacy. I miss you, Kasra. And I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. Losing you, such a tragedy. Can't forget all that you taught me and all that you told me. You were the embodiment of the Orfi poem that says, چنان با خوب و بد سر کن که بعد از مردنت مسلمانش با زمزم شوید و هندو بسوزاند. Thank you. Thank you. I will ask, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I will ask.
بگو تا خبر کنم یاران را ابرا باد را باران را به سراغ من اگر می آیی ای دوست بگو تا خبر کنم یاران را ابرا باد را باران را فرشی از بوی باران زیر پایت خواهم انداخت نغمه ای همچو شبنم نو خواهم ساخت در این شلوغی پر درود برایم سکوت بیاور که هیچ فریادی نیست از آن رساتم که هیچ فریادی نیست از آن رساتم برایم لبخندی بیاور که از چهره شهر من گم گشت برایم خورشیدی بیاور که مهر بارد بر این دشت برایم لبخندی بیاور که از چهره شهر من گم گشت برایم خورشیدی بیاور که مهر بارد بر این دشت. بنشان ساقی میخواران از کنار یاران، مست و گیسو افشان می‌گریزد. بر جام می از شرنگ دوری و از غم مهجوری، چون شرابی جوشان می بریزد. دارم قلبی لرزان ز غمش، دیده شد نگران ساقی میخواران از کنار یاران، مست و گیسو افشان می‌گریزد. آزرده دل از جفای یاری، بی وفا دلداری ماه افسون کاری، شب نخفتم. با یادش تا دامن از کف دادم، شد جهان از یادم، راز عشقش را در دل نهفتم. دارم چشمی گریان به رهش، دیده شد نگران ساقی میخواران از کنار یاران، مست و گیسو افشان می‌گریزد. دارم قلبی لرزان ز غمش، دیده شد نگران ساقی میخواران از کنار یاران، مست و گیسو افشان می‌گریزد.
Thank you, Richie June and Mariam June, for coming and playing for us. It was beautiful. And now I will ask my mother-in-law, who knew Kasra, and well, she has some things to talk about here, to come here.
از خانم‌ها و آقایان محترم که سرافراز فرموده و در این مجلسی که به مناسبت بزرگداشت زندگی کسرای عزیز و همچنین تولد او که در این ماه بوده است شرکت کرده اید بی نهایت سپاسگزارم. از من خواسته شد که شمه‌ای از زندگی کسرای عزیز را برای شما عزیزان بازگو کنم. فکر میکنم که باید اولینه بگم که نام نیکو گر بماند ز آدمی، به کز او ماند سرای زرنگار. کسرای عزیز واقعا مظهر نیکوکاری بود. آنهایی که او را می شناختند و می شناسند هیچگاه او را فراموش نمی کنند. برای من او مانند پسری عزیز بود. البته ما نسبت سببی با هم داشتیم، ولی واقعا او را مانند یکی از فرزندانم دوست داشتم و احترام می‌گذاشتم. حیف که زود از میان ما رخت بربست. زنده یاد کسری وفاداری در فروردین 1946 در یک خانواده زرتشتی در تهران دیده به جهان گشود. او نخستین فرزند زندگی مشترک اردشیر وفاداری و مهرانگیز فیروزگر بود. به مناسبت اینکه اینجا اسم فیروزگر آورده شد، بد نیست که بگویم کسری نواده گشتاسپ فیروزگر بود که مردی بسیار نیکوکار، بسیار رحیم. از جمله کارهایی که کرد یکی را برای نمونه میگویم. او بیمارستان فیروزگر تهران را بنیان نهاد و بعد بیمارستان را به وزارت بهداری اهدا کرد که برای خدمت به بیماران تهیدست آماده باشد. در تمام زندگی مهرانگیز فیروزگر او نماینده وزیر بهداری در بیمارستان فیروزگر بود و این بیمارستان بی نهایت خوب به بیماران بی بضاعت، یعنی واقعا خدمت جالبی میکردن. انقلاب ایران که اتفاق افتاد، یادم میاد که عکس گشتاسپ فیروزگر را از سالن ورودی بیمارستان نمیدونم کی برداشتن. بعد از مدتی مثل اینکه فهمیدن کار نادرستی بوده است، دوباره بعد از مدتی عکس گشتاسپ فیروزگر در سالن ورودی بیمارستان فیروزگر گذاشته شد و هنوز هم من نمیدونم. من الان 20 ساله که در امریکام، ولی ممکنه هنوز هم آنجا باشد. پس به اینجا رسیدیم که او فرزند مشترک اردشیر وفاداری و مهرانگیز فیروزگر بود که پس از او به ترتیب کاوه، کاته، گشتاسپ و کارن زاده شدند. در 10 سالگی برای ادامه تحصیل به انگلیس نزد عمویش فرستاده شد. او از همان دوران تمایلات انترناسیونالیستی داشت و از این رو بود که فرا گرفتن زبانهای فرانسه، آلمانی و اسپرانتو نیز پرداخت. به سال 1964 تحصیلات دبیرستانی را با درجه بسیار خوبی در انگلستان به اتمام رساند و بلافاصله به امریکا رفت و به انستیتوت تکنولوژی ماساچوست یا MIT در رشته فیزیک پذیرفته شد. علاقه زیادی به طبیعت و موسیقی کلاسیک داشت. همیشه دوست داشت با دوچرخه به مدرسه برود. در دوران تحصیل در MIT بود که فعالیت در جنبش ضد جنگ ویتنام را آغاز نهادند. پس از چندی در رشته MIT را و رشته فیزیک را ترک گفته به تحصیل در دانشگاه بوستون پرداخت و لیسانس خود را در ادبیات انگلیسی و علوم اجتماعی از آن دانشگاه دریافت کرد. در این زمان بود که دولت آمریکا او را به خدمت سربازی علیه جنگ ویتنام فراخواند. کسری به علت اینکه زرتشتی بود از پیوستن به ارتش آمریکا و جنگیدن علیه ویتنام امتناع کرد و در عوض فعالیت در راه صلح و نه جنگ را آغاز نمود. وی به سال 1970 به قصد دوبلین به ایرلند مسافرت نمود. در کالج ترینیتی آنجا به تحصیل پرداخت. پس از اخذ دانشنامه فوق لیسانس در رشته آموزش و پرورش مدرن، دوبلین را ترک کرده به برادرش کاوه که در پاریس اقامت داشت پیوست. در آن ایام بود که با دختری به نام لورنس، دختری فرانسوی بود، آشنا شد که پس از چندی به رابطه عاشقانه انجام می‌داد. سرانجام لورنس علی‌رغم شدید خانواده‌اش با کسرا ازدواج کرد و این ازدواج در کلبه کوچک زیبایی که در دهکده‌ای در حومه پاریس قرار داشت برگزار شد. کسرا به قدر این مکان و طبیعت زیبایش را دوست داشت که همیشه آرزو می‌کرد پس از مرگ در آنجا دفن شود. به سال 1973 با شور و اشتیاق فراوان به اتفاق لورنس به ایران بازگشت. در آنجا دارای 2 دختر به ترتیب نام‌های افسانه و آریانا می شود. پیش از انقلاب ایران بود که کسری به کمک لورنس انبار قدیمی بزرگی را که در گاوداری متعلق به پدرش در سعیدآباد شهریار بود که در جنوب تهران واقع شده بود به منزل ساده‌ای برای خود و خانواده‌اش تبدیل کرد. واقعا وقتی که من اونجا رفتم احسنت بهش گفتم. انبار نمیشد بگی اینجا بود، یه آغل گاو و گوسفند بود در واقع. یک انبار خیلی طویلی با طاق بلند ضربی اینجا رو به قدر این مرد زیبا درست کرده بود، 2 طبقه پایینشو، یعنی هیچی بهش اضافه نکرده بود، فقط توشو تزیین کرده بود و دیواراشو درست کرده بود. من اصلا واقعا به ذوق این مرد آفرین گفتم. درست کرده بود برای راحتی خود و فرزندانش و خیلی هم دلش می‌خواست همونجا بین اشخاصی که اونجا کار میکردن، کارگرها، دهقانا و اونا باشه. به منزل ساده ای اونجا رو برای خودش تبدیل کرد. علاقه داشت که در کنار کشاورزان و مردم ساده و بی پیرایه خارج شهر به سر برد. پس از آنکه 2 سال خدمت سربازیش را هم گذرانید، در دانشگاه ملی که نام فعلی آن دانشگاه شهید بهشتی است به تدریس پرداخت. با شروع انقلاب به منظور ایجاد ایرانی دموکراتیک و آزاد بر علیه شاه و رژیم شاهنشاهی فعالیت کرد. در این زمان اون عضو انجمن محافظت محلی ده سعیدآباد بود. هنوز انقلاب نشده بود، مردم شروع می‌کردن اینا. این عضو انجمن سعیدآباد بود. او به هیچ حزب و دسته‌ای تعلق نداشت، ولی همیشه مخالف هر گونه استبداد و مدافع دموکراسی و آزادی بود. در این دوران پس از آنکه در اثر انقلاب فرهنگی کار کلیه دانشگاه‌ها به تعطیل کشید، دانشگاه رو تعطیل کردن، هیچ دانشگاه دیگه نبود، وی ناگزیر به اتفاق خانواده خود به پاریس مراجعت کرد و در آنجا دوباره به کار تحصیل، پژوهش و تدریس زبان انگلیسی پرداخت. او به پژوهش در رشته‌های حقوقی، فرهنگی در رشته‌های حقوقی و فرهنگی ایران باستان، سلوک الملوک در رساله آخرین مجتهد سنی فضل الله روزبهانی و خنجی اصفهانی در دانشگاه سوربن پاریس به مطالعه پرداخت و مقالاتی چند درباره کیش زرتشت نوشت و به چاپ رساند. سرانجام نائل به اخذ درجه دکترا در تاریخ ایران باستان از دانشگاه سوربن پاریس شد. سپس با مقام پروفسوری در دانشگاه نانتر پاریس برای دانشجویان دوره فوق لیسانس به کار تدریس ادبیات انگلیسی و تاریخ تمدن ایران باستان پرداخت و مقالاتی چند به فرانسه و انگلیسی در تعلیم و تربیت منتشر کرد. معلمی محبوب برای شاگردانش بود و کلاس‌هایش همیشه با روح بود. عقیده داشت که معلم نیز باید از شاگردانش بیاموزد. می گفت وقتی کار آموزش در کلاس درس دو طرفه باشد، آموزش استاد به دانشجو و دانشجو به استاد، کار تدریس ثمر بخشتر می شود. کسری هیچگاه علاقه‌ای به زندگی خارج از ایران نداشت. همیشه مترصد بود که در اولین فرصت به زادگاه محبوبش ایران مراجعت کند. این کار آسانی نبود، چون کار فرهنگی و تشکیل خانواده‌اش در فرانسه پا گرفته بود. بالاخره در سال 1992 برای دیداری به اتفاق لورنس به ایران سفر کرد. پس از آن در هر موقعیتی به اتفاق لورنس با دخترهایش یا تنها به ایران می رفت. در این سفرها بود که نظرش به کیش و فرهنگ زرتشت بیشتر جلب شد. درباره آن تحقیق می کرد. رفته رفته این تحقیق و تفحص بیشتر اوقات زندگیش را شامل شد. برای منظور به غالب نقاط ایران و حتی خارج از ایران سفر می‌کرد و با مردم مختلف و متعلق به ادیان و ملیت‌های دیگر مصاحبت و تبادل نظر می‌کرد. سرانجام وقتی فرزندانش به حدی از رشد رسیدند که می‌توانستند بدون وابستگی به خانواده زندگی کنند، کسری به ایران برگشت. در سال 1997 کاندیدای نمایندگی مجلس از طرف انجمن زرتشتیان ایران شد و اکثریت آرا را به دست آورد، ولی به علت مخالفت مراجع کشوری وی از انجام وظیفه باز ماند. اگرچه او بسیار مایوس شد، اما این امر او را از وظیفه فرهنگیش باز نداشت و سبب شد که اهداف خود را از طریق دیگری دنبال کند. کسری در تهران در منزل پدری خود کلاس‌هایی درباره فرهنگ و تاریخ با عناوین تاریخ ایران باستان، اساطیر ایرانی، شاهنامه خوانی، معماری ایرانی و زرتشتی، موسیقی، تئاتر و غیر و غیره برپا کرد. این کلاس‌ها تا هنگام فوت مادرش زنده یاد مهرانگیز فیروزگر ادامه داشت. از آن پس بنیاد مهرانگیز را نیز تأسیس کرد تو همون منزل و به حمایت و پاسداشت حقوق نوجوانان و کودکان پرداخت و با برگزاری نشست‌هایی در دبیرستان فیروز بهرام تهران با حضور روانشناسان کودک و نوجوان و پدر مادرهای زرتشتی در راه پیشرفت این جامعه تلاش کرد. او عقیده داشت که جوانان زرتشتی ضمن اینکه به فرهنگ نیاکان خود متکی هستند، باید در راه تبادلات با فرهنگ‌های دیگر نیز گام بردارند. کوشش می‌کرد که فرهنگ فروخفته و فراموش شده ایرانیان دوباره شکوفا شده و جایگزین فرهنگ غربی در جامعه ایرانی شود و به این منظور سایت یتا اهو را برای زرتشتی‌های جوان راه اندازی کرد که اطلاع رسانی و آشنا کردن جامعه با فرهنگ و تاریخ زرتشت از هدفهای راه اندازی اینسایت بود. وی عهدهدار مسئولیت‌های زیادی بود که از جمله میتوان به این موارد اشاره کرد: مدرس و عضو هیئت مدیره دانشگاه پاریس، مسئول انجمن زرتشتیان مقیم پاریس، عضو انجمن ایرانشناسان اروپا، مدرس دانشگاه شهید بهشتی، معاونت انجمن رودکی فرانسه، عضو سازمان بین المللی کارشناسان دین زرتشت در ژنو. کسری برای همه ادیان و عقاید مختلف احترام خاصی قائل بود و خود را دوستدار و خدمتگزار همه مردم می‌دانست، تا آنجا که در توان او بود از کمک‌های مادی و معنوی به دیگران دریغ نمی‌کرد. اگر کاری از دست او ساخته بود فکر نمی‌کرد که طرف کیست و صاحب چه عقاید و آرایی است. اگر میسر بود فوراً اقدام می‌کرد، چون جنبه انسان دوستی بسیار قوی داشت. او به راستی نمونه‌ای از مفهوم اندیشه نیک، گفتار نیک و کردار نیک بود. بلی، عمر بسیار بباید پدر پیر فلک را تا دگر مادر گیتی چو تو فرزند بزاید، تا دگر مادر گیتی چون کسری بزاید. با تشکر از حضار محترم، یادش گرامی.
Thank you. Meanwhile, please help yourselves with appetizers, coffee and tea. And I would like to ask my friend and Hamkish and Shahnaz Ghaibi to come and talk about Kasra.
به یاد انوشهروان کسرای عزیز، مرد راستینی که با باور به خواسته‌های بزرگ و اندیشه‌های نیکش سر را به این راه نهاد. کسری مردی پرکار بود که می‌خواست با شتاب با گام‌های بلند چند پله را یکی کرده و زودتر به مقاصد والایش برسد. دست دژخیمان امان را از اون سلب کرده و کارهایش را نیمه تمام گذاشت و از میان ما رخت بربست. کسری اندیشه‌های والایی داشت. او با مهربانی تفکرات ژرفنای درونش را با همکیشان و دیگران فراخوانی می‌کرد تا هر یک سهمی در پایه‌گذاری اندیشه‌هایش داشته باشند. کسری پایه‌گذار مرکز فرهنگی در شهر یزد و نیز تعداد بیشماری انجمن‌های مختلف در دیگر اماکن بود. او با مهر و خوشبینی افراد همکیش را به ویژه در یزد گرد هم آورد تا با همازوری دست در دست یکدیگر گذاشته و در خانه‌ای که در یزد خریداری کرده بود آنجا را بنیان نهد. این کار انجام گرفت. جوانان با شوق، حرارت، امید و اطمینان به خواسته‌های پیشرفته کسری به آن خانه می‌رفتند تا به کارهای بایسته به او کمک نمایند. بانوان نیز در پیشرفت کارها شانه به شانه مردان همکاری می‌کردند. زنده یاد کسری در نظر داشت که این خانه را مرکز فرهنگی نامگذاری کند و شروع به جمع‌آوری کتاب‌های دینی، تحقیقی همچنین اشیاء بجا مانده از پدران و نیاکان فراهم آورد. او می‌خواست در این کانون کتابخانه، نمایشگاه آثار باستانی، مرکزی برای همکیشان به منظور گردهمایی باشد. از بانوانی که در خانه به کارهای دستی مانند بافتن کشتی، دوختن صدره، کلاه، مفرش‌های رنگارنگ و شال‌های رنگارنگ با تزیین فروهر اشتغال داشتند، خواست که در این کانون جمع شده و با سرپرستی و آموزش به افراد مشتاق این تولیدات هنری را ادامه دهند تا با گذشت زمان به دست فراموشی سپرده نشوند. زنده یاد کسری مجالس شعرخوانی، گاثه‌خوانی را در تهران دایر کرد. استادانی در این رشته شروع به تدریس نموده و تعداد بیشماری از نوجوانان به یادگیری مشغول شدند. افرادی که به او دلبستگی فراوان داشتند و دارند، نامه‌های پرمحبت و از دل برخاسته ای را به کانون و فامیل فرستادند که دوست دارم در اینجا شمه‌ای از آنها را برایتان بازگو کنم. از جمله نگارش فیروزه درخشانی: نکومردی به دست دشمن افتاد، آوایش بی کلام در پوسته‌ای بر طبل گذران، ضرب آهنگ ریتم زمان را بازنده می نواخت که فریاد و فغان از دست روزگار را به عرش آسمان می برد. دست روزگاری که دشنه به دست دشمن سپرد، دوست را از من ربود، حیران از پلشت زشت خویی که چنین اجازه ای را به خود داده بود تا استاد مهربان بزرگ اندیش ما را از صحنه‌های حضور به عوالم پنهان برکشد و غمی خفقان بار را 200 چندان بر بوته حیرت به آتش درآورد. خشم دشمن بر عضلات چهرم چنان رنگ غیرتی را می‌فشاند که چنگ غمش بر گلویم عربده‌های زجه مرگ او را در گوش نهانیم رها نمی‌کند. ناآرام از جدایی از معرفت ساده دوستیمان بر این زمین خاکی باقی ماندم. تو گویی که دشمن او لگدی هم بر همت گامم میزند تا لب به دندان گیرم و تابع خفقان دشمنش شوم. او مرا برای کنکاش حقایق همراهی میکرد، آنچنان که بخشی از وجود وی مرا هم به مهمانی مرگش کشانیده است. انگار پایکوبی دشمنانش بر قبر او کابوس بامداد تا شامم را مجسم می کند. کسری که به دوستی ما وفادار بود همه را آشتی می داد. دشمنی ها را می بخشید و نابخشودنی ها را به خود می کشید تا برای فامیلش فداکاری و برای بقیه معلمی کند، تا شاگردی چون من از بیان حقایق باکی پیدا نکرده زندگی را برای جشن‌ها لحظه شماری کنم و نه از بابت ناملایمات. او استاد روشنگر ما کسری وفاداری بود. او حرمت انسانها را پاس می داشت و شعور انسانی را قدر می شناخت و پاکی در سرشت انسانیت را وجهه می بخشید. خدایا چرا به دشمن او فرصت دادی تا غافلگیرمان کند و جان او را از ما برباید؟ پیش از آن که دیدار چهره روشنگرش را به هرگز ببری، چرا به ما دوستان و یاران و شاگردانش فرصتی نبخشیدی تا این بزرگ مرد را از سپاسگزاری ما سیراب کنی؟ کسری نخستین زرتشتی بود که خطاب به کل جامعه، اعم از زرتشتی و غیره، منشور جدیدی را برای احیای سنن و باورهای کهن تعریف می کند. با امکانات محدودش تلاش می کرد تا فرهنگ زرتشتیان را احیا کند و این ارزش‌ها را به گوش شنوندگان خود در سراسر ایران برساند. از جمله نامه‌ای از دانشگاه کرمان با ابراز سپاس و قدردانی از ایشان را برایتان بازگو می کنم. بدین وسیله مراتب سپاس و قدردانی خود را از تلاش‌های حضرت عالی به سبب شرکت پذیرش زحمت دبیر علمی سمینار و ارائه نمایشگاه کتاب در همایش بررسی پیشینه فرهنگی ایران که با همت مرکز تحقیقات فرهنگ و زبان ایران دانشگاه شهید باهنر کرمان در روزهای سه‌شنبه تا پنجشنبه مهر ماه سال 1381 برگزار شد اعلام نموده موفقیت و بهکامی جناب عالی را در تمامی زمینه‌های علمی و زندگی از خداوند دانا درخواست می‌نماید. با تشکر و آرزوی توفیق الهی، مسئول مرکز تحقیقات فرهنگ و زبان ایران محمد رضا صدفی. نامه دیگر از گلچهر فلفلی. ناخودآگاه گام‌هایم گیج و گنگ مرا به تالار بزرگ چمی می‌برد تا ببینم مردمی مهربان که در سکوتی تلخ و سؤال برانگیز انگار همه از نزدیکان کسرایند و همه آمدند تا این دروغ بزرگ را باور نکنند. به تالار رفتم. در آنجا آقای فیروز فرد، فرزین فرخمنش، پروین بهمنی و بقیه دوستان دم در ایستاده بودند. خیلی سعی کردم تا بغضم شکسته نشود. چقدر این آدم نجیب و دوست داشتنی و تنها بود. او نمیدانست همه‌مان چه احساس نزدیکی و خویشاوندی نسبت به او داریم. سالن مرتب پر و خالی میشد. کسی مرگ او را باور نمی‌کرد. من هم باور نمی‌کردم. مردان بزرگ هیچ وقت نمی‌میرند. شاد بودن و با هم در شادمانی‌ها شرکت کردن و ارج نهادن به زندگی را از او آموختم تا پاسداران خوب فرهنگ و سنت نیاکان باشیم چون او. و هنوز هم روح بزرگ اوست که ما را گرد هم می آورد تا از مهر بگوییم، از عشق به میهن سرشار شویم و با بال امید و ترانه پرواز کنیم تا اوج سربلندی و سرفرازی ایران و ایرانی. سالگرد تولد این مرد بزرگ و مردمدار را به همه دوستدارانش شاد باش میگویم. قاب عکس او در کنار قاب عکس اشو زرتشت و پدرم هر روز با لبخند شادی مرا به زیستن پرتلاش و امید و مهرفرزی فرا می‌خواند. نوشته‌های دیگر از دیگر شاگردانش. یاد شادروان کسرا وفاداری گرامی و زادروزش خجسته باد. به امید شادی‌ها و موفقیت‌های بیشتر یادش را زنده نگه داریم و راهش را ادامه دهیم. میگویند هر آمدی رفتنی است، هرچند سخت است، ولی میدانیم که همیشه از یادها نمی رود. زهی و حسودی که حیاتش مایه شادمانی، حضورش منشأ سرور و غیابش تداوم حیات است. شگفتا بزرگ مردی که همواره باقی است در قلبمان، در یادمان، در لحظات سرمستیمان. کسرا وفاداری یک انسان واقعی بود و در کار خیر هیچ کوتاهی نمی کرد. امیدوارم هدفش که پیشرفت فرهنگ جامعه زرتشتی بوده دنبال شود و یادش گرامی باد. جهانی است شادان ز پندار نیک، ز پندار نیک است گفتار نیک. چو پندار و گفتار تو نیک شد، نشاید ز تو غیر کردار نیک. روانش شاد و در بهشت برین جایگاهش باد.
شب بخیر. I was a teenager when Kasra organized such an event remembering my grandfather, Ardeshir Vafadari. And this is when he assigned some passages from Gotha for me to read, and with one of my other cousins. And I very much enjoyed reading these passages from Gotha. I'm sorry he's not here today to enjoy the reading, but I hope that you will enjoy it as we remember Kasra. First, a few words in Farsi. اهورامزدا خود خرد، مهربانی، رستگاری و عشاست. عشا که به معنی هنجار هستی و راستی می باشد. منش نیک را برای کار و کوشش و آبادانی. آرامش را برای خوبی و نیکوکاری پدید آورده است و از راه اوست که مردم به رسایی و جاودانی میرسند. زمان اشر و زرتشت دانسته نیست. با این وجود با توجه به جابجا شدن مردمان آریایی و زندگی به شیوه کشاورزی و شهرنشینی، به ویژه با نگاه به زبان کهن گاتا و مقایسه آن با نوشته‌های هند و ایرانی، زمان اشر و زرتشت بین 1200 تا 2000 سال پیش از مسیح بوده است. گاتا یا سرودهای زرتشت، گفتگوها و دریافت‌های درونی اشر و زرتشت از اهورامزدا و آموزش‌های برخاسته از خرد و دانش اوست که روش درست زندگی را در قالب سرود به مردم می‌آموزد. زبان و گویش گاتا نسبت به بخش‌های دیگر اوستا بسیار کهن‌تر است. گاتا خود بخشی از یسنا و هر دو بخشی از کتاب اوستاست. I am honored to be joined by my dear friend Mobed Jimmy Antia to read you some passages from Gata. Do you have something to say too, or should we just start? Yeah, you should pray. Okay. یسنای 31 بند 8. ای مزدا، هنگامی که تو را با نیروی خرد و اندیشه ژرف جستجو کردم و با دیده دل نگریستم، دریافتم که تویی سرآغاز و سرانجام همه چیز. تویی سرچشمه خرد و اندیشه و تویی آفریننده راستی و پاکی و تویی داور نیک کردار مردمان جهان.
I recognize thee, O Mazda, in my thought, that thou first art and also the last, that thou art the father of the good mind. When I apprehend thee with my mind's eye, thou art the true creator of righteousness, and art the Lord to judge the actions of all life.
یسنای 43 بند 5. آنگاه تو را پاک شناختم ای مزدا اهورا که تو را سرآغاز و سرانجام همه چیز دانستم و دریافتم که تو از روز نخست نتیجه و بازتاب هر گفتار و کردار نیک یا بدی را مقرر فرمودی و داوری تو پیوسته بر این اصل است که بدی بهره بدان و نیکی پاداش نیکان است.
As the Holy One, I recognize thee, O Mazda, when I saw thee at the beginning, at the birth of life, when thou madest actions and words to have their meaning, evil for evil, good for the destiny of good, through thy wisdom, when all creation shall reach its goal.
یسنای 43 بند 8. آنگاه به خود پاسخ داده گفتم من زرتشتم و تا آنجا که نیرو دارم دشمن سرسخت دروغ و پشتیبان استوار راستی خواهم بود تا زمانی که همه جهانیان به کشور جاویدان راستی راه یابند. از این روی همیشه ای مزدا تو را ستایشگر و با سرودهای نیایش تو را خواهم ستود.
Then I said to him, to the first question, Zarathustra am I, a true foe to the liar, to the utmost of my power, but a powerful supporter would I be to the righteous, that I may attain the future things of the infinite dominion, according as I praise and sing thee, O Mazda.
یسنای 45 بند 5. من سخن میگویم از آنچه که مزدای پاک به من آموخت، سخنی که شنیدنش برای مردم بهترین آموزش هاست و آن اینکه کسی به پایه رسایی و جاودانی خواهد رسید که به ندای وجدان خود گوش دهد و بدان ارج گذارد چه خوشنودی اهورامزدا از راه اندیشه نیک و کردار درست. آنچه که وجدان گوید به دست می آید.
I will speak of that which the Lord declared to me as a word that is best for all humans to obey. Thou, for whose sake render me obedience, shall all attain unto welfare and immortality by the actions of the good spirit, or spentamenio.
یسنای 31 بند 11. ای مزدا، هنگامی که در روز نخست با خرد خیش به کالبد ما جان بخشیدی و به ما نیروی اندیشه و قوه تمیز نیک از بد دادی، از آن روزی که در تن ما خاکی ما جان و روان دمیدی و به ما اراده و نیروی گفتار و کردار ارزانی داشتی، خواستی که هر کس بنا به اراده خود و با آزادی کامل راهی را که خود صلاح داند برگزیند.
When thou, O Mazda, in the beginning did create man and mankind through thy spirit and powers of understanding, when thou didst make life clothed in the body, and when thou madest actions and teachings, whereby one may exercise one's conviction at one's free will. Thank you. Thank you.
As an adult, I met Kasra once. He was chatting with my elder brother in the corridors of a building where a conference on Ferdowsi was being held in Hamburg. My brother introduced me to him. That one meeting left a profound impression on me. Most of all, I remember Kasra's smile. His eyes smiled. He came across as a true follower of the teachings of Zarathustra. I remember Kasra. He lives in my heart. His memory is alive. When Kate asked me to talk about Zarathustra's philosophy and teachings this evening, I was delighted, not just because the subject is so dear to me. I have to come, I'm sorry, okay. Can you hear me? Is this better? Okay. Not because the subject is so close and dear to me, but also because speaking about the teachings and philosophy of Zarathustra at the celebration of the life of one of his true followers is an honor for me. To put Zarathustra's philosophy and teaching in perspective, I find it necessary to briefly talk about the environment and the time in which Zarathustra lived. But before I do so, I would like to point out that most everything I say this evening on this subject is my take of what I have heard other people speak, the books I have read, and what I have learned on Zoroaster's philosophy and life. And I have been most influenced by a single book by the name of Mazda Khoda Nist by the late Khosrow Keshavarz. Zarathustra was born about 1000 BC, plus or minus 300 years. At that time, the general population were either city dwellers or nomads. The city dwellers were divided into sects, such as the noblemen, the clergy, the craftsmen, the farmers, and so forth. And the nomads roamed the desert and were mostly herders. Often they attacked the city dwellers for food and goods. Zarathustra was born into the clergy sect. People were made to believe in many gods at that time, and praying to each god had its own complicated rituals that only the clergy could conduct. The cause of all ills, unknowns, such as earthquakes, floods, droughts, diseases, deaths, the cause of all those ills were attributed to the wrath of one god or another. The function of the clergy was to appease these gods through complicated rituals and sacrifices, which was costly. And it was the general population, the other sects, that had to pay the costs of these rituals. This state of being, however it came to be about, was very beneficial for the clergy. It worked well for them. And for the status quo to maintain, people needed to remain ignorant and superstitious. Just as the noblemen needed wars to conquer more land and add to the wealth, the farmers, the craftsmen, the traders needed peace in order to be able to bring their crops to fruition, trade, and so forth. The clergy needed to make sure that ignorance prevails. This was the only way that they can build a stronger clientele for their complicated rituals. Zarathustra could see the fraud of the clergy up close and first hand because he was born into the clergy and he was being taught the way of the clergy. Obviously, he didn't like it, and he set out to eradicate ignorance and superstition. This made him an outcast of the clergy immediately. Because of his confrontation with the clergy, who was quite powerful and wealthy, he had to leave his place of birth. He was admitted into the court of a local king, who received him well and gave him freedom to express his thoughts and freedom for his teachings. He took full advantage of that freedom. What has survived from Zarathustra today is the Gatha, which is a collection of hymns. The Avesta, which is considered the religious book of the modern Zoroastrian, was mostly written during the Sassanid dynasty and is composed of the Gatha as well as other sections which were added at that time, at the time of the Sassanid dynasty, which was centuries after Zarathustra. But the teachings of Zarathustra are compromised, are in the Gatha. The cornerstone of Zarathustra's teachings and philosophy is that every person who listens to another with a free will needs to decide for themselves the value and validity of what has been said. This includes Zarathustra's teaching. In other words, Zarathustra encouraged people to listen to him and ponder about what he is saying. Think about it. And only accept his teachings if it made sense to them. The concept is very simple and totally applicable to modern life. Yet the application of it, in my opinion, is a bit more difficult than it sounds. It is not easy to clear one's mind of prejudices and preconceived notions when trying to judge the validity and value of a new concept, especially one that might go against the grain of what you have been taught, especially if this new concept is seemingly radical. Zarathustra did not prophesy the future, nor did he bring a message from any of the gods. He was neither a prophet nor a Messiah. Nevertheless, today, he is considered by many Zoroastrians to be a prophet, mainly because the influence of his teachings and his philosophy has influenced other religions that believe that the founder of their religion was a prophet or a Messiah. How Zoroastrianism influenced other religions is a huge topic by itself, and I'm not going to go into that, but just to mention historical mentions of that influence. Cyrus the Great, a follower of Zoroaster's teachings, king of Persia, performed so many good deeds that his name is mentioned in the Jewish religious book as a savior. According to Christian religious book, 3 Magis or Mog, who are followers of Zoroaster's teachings or Zarathustra's teachings and propagate his teachings, actively seeked out and were present at the birth of Christ, who is considered the prophet of Christianity. The religious book of Islam mentions Zoroastrianism as one of the 4 religions it recognizes. These mentions tell us that Zoroastrianism has influenced those religions. The motto of the modern Zoroastrian is good thought, good words, good deeds. Again, a very simple and elegant motto. Yet the execution, in my opinion again, is a little harder than it sounds. All I really have to do is to reflect on the past week of everything I said, I thought, and I did. And I see not everything was necessarily good. The source of this motto, however, which is a teaching of Zarathustra, is even more profound than the motto itself. Let me explain with an example. Zarathustra observed the human condition and set out to improve it. This is the good deed, improve human condition. Now the question is how? This is where the thought process comes in. And for the deed to succeed, the thought has to be sound. This is the good thought. Zarathustra did not formulate his thought overnight. His thoughts evolved and matured over time. But the target of all those thoughts were the improvement of the human condition. What Zarathustra infers in his teachings is that a good deed that is the outcome of the application of a good thought improves the well-being, improves one's own well-being. The proof of this statement is the fact that Zoroastrians are generally perceived to be honest and trustworthy people in every community that they have a history in, such as Iran, India, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and more. Zarathustra believed that everything in the universe is in harmony and follows certain natural laws. Any deed that is in harmony with these laws provides a positive impact on the human condition. Any deed that contends the harmony has a potential negative impact on the human condition. This does not mean that Zarathustra or anyone else has full knowledge of those laws or even knows what is out there that is in harmony. We just know that harmony is there. Scientists are learning new things every day and making new discoveries every day. Some of those discoveries are still beyond our understanding. Black matter, for an example. But that does not mean that we will never understand it. This brings me to the notion of Mazda. Mazda is a composite word. It's composed of maz, meaning big, large, huge, and da, meaning knowledge, derived, or the root of the word danish. Mazda is that great knowledge that we are trying to attain. Mazda is the knowledge that encompasses all the natural laws that govern harmony in the universe. It is through our efforts to attain Mazda that we can eradicate ignorance and superstition and improve the human condition. I will let you two reach your own conclusion and make up your own minds. Thank you.
Dr. Monica Ringer is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Amherst College. Monica Ringer studied with Hossein Ziai and Nikki Kedi at UCLA, receiving a master's in Islamic Studies, where she also received her PhD in Modern Middle Eastern History. Her first book is entitled Education, Religion, and the Discourse of Cultural Reform in Qajar, Iran. She has published articles in a number of books and journals. She teaches Middle Eastern history at Amherst College. Her current research explores religious reform and modernization in the Zoroastrian community in Iran and India in the 19th and 20th centuries. Tonight, Dr. Ringer will be talking from her latest published work, Pious Citizens, Reforming Zoroastrianism in India and Iran. Please welcome Dr. Monica Ringer.
Thank you, Neda, for the generous welcome. And thank you, Kate, for inviting me to participate in this event specially organized to commemorate the memory of Kasra. I'm honored for the opportunity to add my own voice to many of yours who have been influenced by Kasra. In fact, I really credit him in particular with inspiring my own research on Zoroastrianism. It happened on my very first trip to Iran, on the very first evening, when I had recently published a book on 19th century educational reform, and he said, "What about the Zoroastrian schools?" And I thought, oh, yes. I wonder why those didn't make it into the book. So what began as sort of a quest to fill that particular gap led me a little bit more into the Zoroastrian community and its history, an interest facilitated by Kasra's help with sources, with contacts, and not least his very able chauffeur. I've dedicated some of my work to Kasra, but it's the least I could do to recognize his important place in my own intellectual journey and to commemorate his dedication to a vibrant Zoroastrian community at home and abroad. And with the continued emphasis on larger conversations between people and between religions, I thought I would say a few words, and I promise that this is actually not as many pages as it looks, and it's blown up, so I don't need to use my glasses, on relations between India and Iranian Zoroastrians, specifically imagined historical, racial, and religious connections, which speak very much to the emerging conversation about shared civilization that developed in the 20th century in Iran and India. The story of the Parsi mission to Iran in the 1850s is by now a familiar one. Many of you probably know the story of the sending of Manekji Hateria from Parsis in Iran to fund schools, build dakhmes and buildings for communal worship, to reform religious practices and establish anjumans. Of course, he's most famously known for agitating with Nasir al-Din Shah for the repeal of the jizya tax burden on Zoroastrians, and his close contact with European diplomats who put in good words on his behalf, eventually succeeding in having it rescinded legally, if not actually in practice, in 1888. Hateria changed the Iranian Zoroastrian community. They became more influential, they had more economic connections and trade with Bombay. Great Britain was prepared to intercede on their behalf, and certainly in the context of the Qajar larger secularizing reforms, that minimalized Sharia sartorial and other restrictions, the Zoroastrians as a community flourished. So really the story of Zoroastrian reform in 19th century and 20th century Iran begins with one of Parsi influence on Iran. But there's, of course, another story, not one of Parsis' influence on Iran, but of Iran's influence on the Parsis. I would like to tell that story, the story that took place in the imagination of the Indian Zoroastrian community. In particular, how Iran was reimagined in relation to Parsi identity and their sense of history that was spurred by the re-examination of religious beliefs in historical context. In particular, I'm just going to give you a sense of two of the most prominent of these 19th century texts, Hataria's Mission to Iran and Framji's History of the Parsis. The project of Parsi religious reform, sorry, my glasses are falling, rested on premises of historicism, on the idea that the pure kernel of Zoroastrianism had over the course of history become encrusted with foreign, inauthentic accretions, so that reform consisted of, if you will, an archaeological cleansing off of historical detritus to the recovery of the original essential truth of Zoroaster's message. Accordingly, Parsi reformists and religious scholars were invested in the rediscovery of true Zoroastrianism. This was necessarily a project of historicizing Zoroastrian practice, even as the project itself denied its own historical context. The recovery effort involved the exploration of the Zoroastrian past, both as a religion, in the sense of what were the essential beliefs, but also as a community. How had the religion been practiced over time? It is no coincidence, therefore, that Parsi reformists in the mid-19th century began to write new histories of the community in search of this pure, essential past. Of course, this recovery of the Zoroastrian past was also one of rediscovering the ancient Iranian past. Ancient Iran, already understood as the ancestral homeland of the Parsis, was reimagined as an idealized, ahistorical past, one in which the essential truths of Zoroaster's message manifested themselves in civilizational superiority. Parsis emphasized their own connection to this past by means of the trope of exile, an exile which defined them by race and religion as authentically Iranian. Now, two of the earliest of these histories, written in really the mid-19th century, were Framji's Parsis, Their Histories, Manners, Customs, and Religion in 1858, and Hataria's own A Parsi Mission to Iran about 10 years later in 1865. Framji's account is quite possibly the first history of Zoroastrians written in the 19th century context of religious reform by a leading reformist. It was widely read, frequently alluded to in subsequent histories, and clearly illustrates the emerging confluence of race, religion, and civilization that would become hallmarks of later Zoroastrian histories. Framji wrote his history expressly in order to introduce Zoroastrians to the British. He therefore dwells on those elements of Zoroastrianness that he believed were most important to emphasize to a British audience. His emphasis on ancient Iranian history as embodying the essence of religion and civilizational character thus must be read in the context of his deliberate attempt to align Parsis with the British in religion, civilization, and ultimately progress. Hataria's account of his travels, published some 10 years later, also contains much commentary on a mythologized ancient Iran in order to locate idealized religious and civilizational characteristics in that period, and to explicitly connect Parsis to an Iranian homeland. From the outset, Framji outlines profound connections between race, religion, civilization, and progress, and I quote, "Parsis are a distinct race, and that neither in their religion nor in their habits of life do they assimilate with either the Mohammedans or the Hindus. Western civilization has had a great influence on their characters. It must be evident that the Parsis form a striking exception to the other Oriental races," end quote. In this striking passage, Framji posits that religion is inseparable from race. Religion distinguishes Zoroastrians from other races and is the cause of their predisposition towards Western civilization, read progress. He is clearly of the conviction, whether consciously or unconsciously, that certain forms of religious belief and practice are generative of internal dispositions and sensibilities. In other words, that true religion produces progressive habits of life, values, and belief systems as it molds individual characters. Framji eagerly claims essential ratio religious difference from both Hindus and Muslims in an attempt to align Parsis with the British. Remember, too, that he is writing this history in the context of religious reforms that are rationalized as purifying Zoroastrianism from Hindu and, in the Iranian context, from Muslim elements that had been unwittingly assimilated over time. Chapter 1, and I promise it's not going to be all the chapters. Chapter 1 of Framji's history, entitled Historical Sketch, is comprised of 5 sections which undergird his conception of Parsi history. Although he doesn't explicitly subtitle the sections, they are clearly distinguishable as Iran before the conquest, conquest, Iran after the conquest, Exodus, and Parsis in India. Iran before the conquest is described in superlatives. The vast Persian Empire, quote, whose grandeur, magnificence, and glory were unequaled by any nation of ancient times, whose kings were at once the most powerful of monarchs and the wisest and most beneficent of rulers, end quote. This empire was then destroyed by Mohammedan conquerors. The conquerors exhibited qualities necessitated by their different religious beliefs. And I quote, "Toleration in religion is unknown to the haughty, uncivilized barbarian believers of the Quran. Bigotry is the highest virtue demanded of the Mohammedan, and one which secures him favor in the eyes of his prophet and his God," end quote. In Framji's understanding, faith determines values. Prophets pass on essential characteristics of religious belief. In the case of Islam, bigotry, intolerance, and brutality. This is borne out by his assertion that due to subsequent persecution and hardship, the majority of Zoroastrians converted to Islam and as a result lost their good characters. It is also worth noting in this regard that Framji identifies the conquerors as Muslims, not Arabs. Religion generates civilization, not vice versa, and as such the dominant signifier of difference. Framji's explanation of Zoroastrian exodus from Iran to India occupies a central and lengthy place in the chapter. It clearly draws much of its narrative from the Qisse-i Sanjan, the Zoroastrian history of migration from Iran, composed in 1599. In Framji's day, the Qisse was regarded as authoritative, although many scholars since have cast aspersions on its accuracy. According to Framji, despite hardship and persecution, some Zoroastrians remained true to their faith, and in order to safeguard it, quote, sought asylum in the country of the Hindus, end quote. It was thus a matter of the preservation of the faith that led the Parsis to India, and I quote again, "Rather than abandon the faith they had inherited from their fathers, they had voluntarily made themselves exiles forever from the land that gave them birth and were now at the mercy of strangers for a home," end quote. India is described as a prayed-for deliverance. Framji differs, I think, importantly in emphasis from the Qisse, even though that's obviously his primary source for this story. The Qisse privileges avoidance of persecution as the primary impetus for Zoroastrian departure from Iran. Yet Framji subtly emphasizes preservation of true religion as a rationale. The story thus subtly changes from one of flight to one of exodus, one of self-preservation to one of guardianship of religious purity. Following the traditional narrative established by the Qisse-i Sanjan, Framji recounts the negotiation between the newly arrived Zoroastrians and the Prince of Sanjan, who ultimately allows them to reside in Iran. He faithfully provides the legendary 16 articles of faith that are recorded in the Qisse and which have been understood by the Zoroastrian community as accurate representations of their beliefs upon arrival in India. However, as a reformist, Framji prefers a radical reinterpretation of these articles of faith. He argues that they have to be read in the context of the Zoroastrians' desperate attempt to remain safely in India. He therefore suggests that the Zoroastrians were prepared to dissimulate their own beliefs at the time in order to satisfy Hindu sensibilities. And he writes, "They concealed from the prince all that would have appeared extraordinary or offensive to him and his subjects, and supplied in place thereof ceremonies which had an origin exclusively Hindu." Framji's gloss here allows him to problematize the description of Zoroastrianism contained in the Qisseh, and to insist that, in line with reformist convictions, Zoroastrianism was monotheistic and decidedly less ritualistic than described in these 16 articles of faith. Considering the reform effort underway to rid Zoroastrianism of Hindu superstitions, it's not surprising that he explains any commonalities with Hindu practices as of much later prominence, and insists that at the time of arrival in India, Zoroastrianism was correctly practiced. Okay. The remainder of Framji's history concerns the Indian period and stresses Parsi achievements and shared sensibilities with the British. In Chapter 2, he takes the opportunity to stress the ratio religious difference between Zoroastrians and Muslims, implicitly aligning the former with the British. It's a rather long quote, but it's quite good, so I'll read it. "The physical and moral condition of the Parsis in Persia have remained unchanged since the time when they called the country their own. Centuries of oppression have not been able to destroy the strong, muscular, and hardy appearance of the Zoroastrian. He is greatly superior in strength to the modern effeminate and luxurious Persian," with apologies to all the luxurious Persians in the audience, "and is ever willing to work, could he find employment. Centuries of contact with a weak and idle race have not exercised any perceptible influence upon the habits of industry for which the ancestors of the Parsis were remarkable. The Zoroastrian is taught by his religion to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, whereas the Muslim is taught to believe that he will be favored by God by becoming a fakir and living on alms. It is a fact credible to the blood which flows in Zoroastrian veins that the race has not degenerated by contact with those by whom fate has surrounded them. The same may be said of their moral conduct." End quote. What I think is most notable here, and is a constant theme in Framji's history, is the assertion of difference between Zoroastrians and other Oriental races. In the preceding passage, he constructs a dichotomy between the strong, muscular Zoroastrian and the effeminate Muslim, between industry and sloth, between work as God's intent and predestinarianism, between morality and immorality. In this, he is profoundly influenced by British Protestant sensibilities in his effort to claim that Zoroastrianism, reformed and rationalized, is similarly progressive and conducive of enlightened sensibilities and dispositions. Now, turning briefly to Hotteria's Parsi mission to Iran, of course, it is a record of his travel to Iran, not a history per se, and so can't be compared exactly in form or content to Framji's history of the Zoroastrians. Nevertheless, Hotteria evidences a very similar connection between religion, race, and civilization, as does Framji. Though his focus on ancient Iranian history as a uniquely Zoroastrian heritage, Hotteria, like Framji, presents a transcendental Zoroastrian identity, one that is fastened to a time and place, ancient Iran, and thus transcends exodus, separation, and subsequent history. Iranian and Indian Zoroastrians, as a ratio-religious group and bound together through shared history, are indelibly connected to Iran and to each other. Hotteria, not surprisingly, spends a good deal more time discussing ancient Iran than does Framji. While Framji accords ancient Iran grandeur and greatness, Hotteria mythologizes it. His description of ancient Iran as a garden of paradise and the sign of heaven portrays Iran as a mythic country. I would argue that this myth of ancient Iran allows him to construct ancient Iran ahistorically as more civilized, more scientifically advanced even than the present. Whereas Framji writes that ancient Iran was, quote, unequaled by any nation of ancient times, end quote, ancient Iran in Hotteria's rendering is more civilized than the present. And I quote, the ancient Iranians were far superior and civilized than the people of today. Modern science of today is filled with awe at their equipment and their constructions. The ancient Iranians were far advanced in all ways of life, end quote. Hotteria's version of ancient Iran thus functions as more than a past example of greatness. It is a yardstick against which to measure the shortcomings of the present and a template upon which to model the future. Note, too, that past greatness is measured according to contemporary criteria of civilization and progress, in other words, science, hygiene, brotherhood, morality, piety, political domination, for example. Hotteria thus denounces a positivist rendering of human history, instead positing a model of rediscovery of the past as a way forward to the future. The connection between the past and the future define the interim period, precisely the period of Islamic rule, as an anomaly, an intermission, a gap that can be bridged through the reappropriation of ancient Iranian civilization. It will come as no surprise that Hotteria was in dialogue with many Iranian intellectuals interested in ancient Iran, such as Prince Jalaluddin Mirza and Mirza Fakhr Ali Akhundzadeh. There was substantial correspondence amongst them, and it is entirely likely that Hotteria played a seminal role in sparking an interest in the modern possibilities of ancient Iran amongst Iranian proto-nationalists. Hotteria and Framji also concur on the story of exile and separation. On the one hand, Zoroastrian exile to India was one of loss, of separation from the Iranian fatherland. On the other hand, it's a triumphal story of the preservation of religion, of race, and of civilization. It is a victory of survival despite the conquest, one that both ensures a permanent link to the homeland and offers the possibility of full redemption through a return to Iran or conversely, a return to ancient Iranian splendor. Hotteria's mission in many ways is cast as his own return, as the beginnings of the rediscovery and reclamation of the ancient past. His collection of ancient coins and artifacts and his careful notation as he traveled around Iran of ancient Zoroastrian sites complement his own role as regenerator and renovator of the Zoroastrian community in Iran. The Parsi identification with Iran makes them an exilic community which profoundly shaped their relationship to India. As a minority caught between British affiliation and Indian independence, between India as home and India as exile. But what I want to emphasize here, in conclusion, is that the beginnings of this consciousness of a shared historical past that took on these new connotations emerged out of the 19th century religious reform movement that subjected tradition and history to new scrutiny, and in so doing, reconstructed both. Such early histories made important and lasting connections between religion and civilization and progress, and generated a deep intimacy between ideas of race and nation that remain characteristic of Parsi conceptions of self in the 20th century. Thank you for your indulgence.
I thank you very much for your wonderful speech. Please, Ustad Davudian. I don't think Ustad Davudian needs any introduction. I would like to thank you for giving us this honor and playing for us here tonight.
Yes.
متشکرم استاد. از دست و زبانه که برایت. خیلی ممنون. خیلی متشکرم. افتخار دادین ما رو. خیلی ممنون. خیلی متشکرم. خواهش میکنم بفرمایین برای صرف شام. خیلی ممنون از همه.